Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Freely Nourished, the podcast that empowers you to break the cycle of dieting by teaching you to nourish your bodies well. I'm your host, registered dietitian, Erin Casey, and I am also the owner of New You Nutrition Counseling, where we believe that you can reach all of your healthcare goals at just about any body size. So you are ready to let go of the toxic, shame-ridden cycle of dieting and step into a world where you feel free to nourish yourself with all of your favorite foods, as well as enjoy wonderful health as a result of balance and moderation, then head over to our website. I'll link it in the show notes below. And we will get you started on the path towards a sustainable and joyful life around food and body. Today I wanted to talk to you about something that, frankly, I just get asked by just about every client I have walk through my doors. And I honestly get it a lot through a lot of my social media accounts as well. So that is how to calculate the appropriate calories that for you and kind of what you're going for. As well as how to break down your macros a little bit. If you have no interest in counting calories or breaking down macros, then honestly, feel free to skip this episode. It may just not be for you. That said, I think it's kind of important to hear a little bit about where those numbers come from, because frankly, a lot of what I see out there from influencers and frankly, people who just don't really understand nutrition and don't really know what they're talking about is a lot of generic meal plans. Even doctors will give generic meal plans. They'll tell women to blindly follow a 1,200 calorie diet, even though a 1,200 calorie diet is frankly appropriate for a toddler. And there's just so much misinformation out there about it. You may, if you follow my account, you may follow other accounts that are kind of like, well, you have to be in a calorie deficit if your goal is to lose weight. But you might kind of be like, okay, well, like, what is a calorie deficit? Like, where should I be aiming for? If those are the types of questions you have, then listen up. This whole episode is geared just for you. And you certainly can, if you want, more personalized information, if you're not sure if you're doing the math right. By all means, you can book a discovery call with us. Those are things that are like very quick and easy for us to flesh out over the phone, even. We just need a couple of metrics from you and maybe a little bit more information. So honestly, like, you don't need a dietitian to do that. Like, personal trainers are able to do this. Some people who call themselves nutritionists, which, if you don't know, the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist is the level of education. So a dietitian has significantly more education. We have at least a bachelor's degree. Most of us have a master's degree. We've also gone through a 1,200 hour at minimum internship and have taken a really big, qualifying exam and things like that. Literally anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. There's no like rhyme or reason to it. So a lot of people are out there claiming to be nutritionists, nutrition coaches, things like that, and they don't have the education to properly counsel people on diet changes. But that said, when it comes to basic calculations of calorie needs, those are things that they can and can appropriately give you. That said, those people who are not dietitians should not be writing meal plans for you. They should not be telling you how to get your whatever your calorie goals end up being, but they can tell you appropriately kind of what those calorie goals should be. And even your doctor, I mean, your doctor obviously has more education than even I do. That said, their education is not in nutrition. They certainly can give you a meal plan and they can give you a calorie goal, but it should be based on your metrics. If you don't see them doing any math in the process of your appointment, big red flag, right? Like, that there is the red flag. And that goes for anybody, right? If anybody else is just like looks at you and hands you a meal plan or hands you a calorie goal or macro goals, big red flag. They should at minimum need your height, your weight, and what we call like your activity level, which is kind of a basic of kind of how active you are day to day, not just in your workout. So your trainer may know your workouts, but they should also be very well aware of like what your activity looks like throughout the rest of the day, because that changes things as well. So anyway, that was kind of a long, kind of shameless plug for dietitians. Like, we have a lot of expertise in this area. That said, basic things like calorie calculations and stuff like that, many other providers, including trainers and non-medical providers, nutrition coaches, etc., can do and often do very well and very responsibly. If you find, again, that like you're finding that you're getting a blanket meal plan, or somebody's not taking in those anthropometric measures to calculate your needs, then that's a big red flag. I wouldn't trust that person. But you also don't need any of us, right? So this is something that I go over with just about every patient that walks through my door. So I just wanted to provide a quick little tutorial as to how you can do it yourself, because you don't need me. And if you want me to go through it or kind of, talk through ideas, by all means, book a discovery call. I'll gladly chat with you about it. But I'm also happy to give you the information for free. So the first thing you want to do, and I personally use MedCalc for this part, but there are other online calculators. So you want to find yourself a BMR calculator. So it's B as in boy, M as in Mary, R as in, I don't know, Rudolph. So that calculates your basal metabolic rate, is what BMR stands for. So you can just kind of type into Google like basic BMR calculator, and one should pop up for you. Like I said, MedCalc is the one that I use because that's what I use for other equations too. More complicated things like, people on vents and stuff like that. But that said, you don't have to use MedCalc. There's plenty of other ones out there. They are just standardized calculators that have standardized equations in them. The equation that I use for most ambulatory, healthy, non-hospitalized adults is what's called the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. And I'll put this in the show notes in case you're just curious about it. In the practice of dietetics, honestly, in most of medicine practice in the United States, that seems to be the most standard from what the research shows. That's honestly what lines up closest with people's actual metabolic demand. You can get more in-depth testing to more accurately assess your BMR, because of course the BMR calculator is going to measure the amount of calories your body consumes just being like if you were a vegetable, right? It doesn't take into account any activity. It is your basal metabolic rate. Basal means baseline or like bottom level, right? So it is like the minimum number of calories your body needs to function and just keep you alive and well, not taking into account any activity. I think there's a really big misnomer, and I just want to pause here and talk about this for a second. There's a really big misnomer that your activity level and how much you work out dramatically increases your calorie burn. It can, depending on what you're doing. But frankly, for most of us, unless you are an athlete, you're doing 2-a-days or kind of, really intensive type workouts, frankly, it doesn't impact it nearly as much as you think. Your workout may be somewhere from like 200 to 500 calories at absolute most, day to day, right? Now, that's not also accounting for if you're doing weight training, muscle protein synthesis, and things like that happen kind of, behind the scenes outside of your actual workout. But still, that's kind of like at most what most of us are getting, and kind of like an average hour-long workout a couple of times a week. Most of your calorie needs have nothing to do with your activity. By and large, like at least 2/3 of your metabolic needs for most people, again, athletes and people who are extremely active or have very active jobs, that may be slightly different. But for most people who have kind of a sedentary job, they work out a couple of times a week, at least 2/3 of your calories are coming from just your body maintaining life. And I think that's where kind of like the idea of putting people on a 1,200 calorie diet is so ridiculous, because nobody's BMR is 1,200 calories, right? Like their body, just to maintain life, to maintain good energy levels, to maintain good function, is probably going to need at baseline, most people, like at least 1,500 calories. Many of us are much, much more. So it's just kind of absolutely ridiculous to put somebody on that significant of a deficit, which again is why that's a huge red flag. But anyway, so I use the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. That's kind of the standard of practice in dietetics, but also just kind of across the medical community, for healthy adults who are ambulatory, or ambulatory is like a fancy word for saying mobile, right? For who are able to move around and don't have any type of like paralysis or things like that going on. You can get what is called a metabolic cart study. which it usually involves you like breathing into a tube for a period of minutes. What they're measuring is like the on-off rate of oxygen and CO2 in your lungs. And that actually can be backtracked to kind of how your metabolism is functioning as a whole. You could also do a little bit more in-depth like body composition testing, because the Mifflin St. George uses your weight, but it doesn't tell you, and it kind of just standardizes composition based on that. But it, again, like athletes in particular might be more muscular and at a higher weight, but the assumption of kind of composition for that weight may not be appropriate for them. They may have more muscle and less fat, that kind of thing. So those are things that you can definitely get done to get a more accurate picture of what your BMR is looking like. Those things, there's going to vary in terms of accessibility. Of course, it's going to come with a price tag. That said, I mean, a lot of them are accessible. So, there's certainly, worth looking into in your area if you think that your body or your body type doesn't quite fit the standard mold. Or if you're just kind of curious and like you really want a good baseline. I think that's, those are totally appropriate things to look for. That said, the calculators honestly do a fairly good job of predicting. And honestly, like ICU physicians are like continuously blown away by how accurately these equations work for the majority of people, especially even like sick people on hospital beds and things like that. So they're very impressed by the estimators. So assuming that you are using a calculator, so you plug in, your height, your weight, your age. Those are the main and your gender, which I know that, gender can be kind of a sticky subject. To be honest, the BMR calculations, like the difference in gender is very small. So like, honestly, it doesn't matter. Like, if you're 5'10", 200 pounds and about 30 years old, whether you select male or female, frankly, that's going to be a negligible difference. If I have somebody who's in the process of transitioning from one to the other, I literally just plug in both and take the average, which again, like we're talking of a difference of less than 200 calories. Like it is a very negligible difference. And again, these are all estimators. So that's kind of our baseline. And that's kind of what we're basing it off of. It may be higher or lower for you, one, depending on your gender, sure, but also depending on just general lifestyle factors, how much muscle mass you have, because muscle is more active metabolically than fat typically. So, like all of this is going to vary person to person. And that's where having a dietitian come in and say, okay, here are the numbers, here's what I'm doing, but like something's not feeling right or something's not, just quite jiving with me. That's where you want to bring in a dietitian to kind of really fully kind of like pull that apart, dive deep into it. And that's where you do want a dietitian. You don't want a nutrition coach. You don't want a trainer. They don't know enough about nutrition to figure that stuff out. Good ones, even your doctor probably doesn't know enough about nutrition to kind of really tease that apart the way it needs to be teased apart. Good, doctors, trainers, coaches, things like that, they're going to know that. And they're going to be like, you should see a dietitian. And if they're like, act like they know it, and they don't have a credential, you might want to ask kind of where they're getting that information from. They may be consulting with a dietitian behind the scenes and like are just not sharing that information with you. But I would kind of ask some questions unless it's somebody that has a higher degree, and even has a higher degree in nutrition, because like I said, doctors they know a lot of things that I don't know how to do, but I know more about nutrition than any doctor on the face of this planet. I will say that full confidence. So anyway, we get our BMR. So that is the absolute lowest number you should ever eat in a day. That is what your body needs to maintain life. Now, what I find very often in my patients is that they are typically eating well below that BMR. Sometimes they're not sure, and that's where tracking, we don't love tracking around here because it can definitely be triggering. But tracking can actually be very helpful to kind of see, okay, where am I relative to that number? What I find very often is that people are actually eating well below it, and that's why they're so stuck. It's because they're underfeeding their body so chronically that their body has actually lowered its own BMR. So that's another thing I want to point out, is that your BMR will change. The calculation is always going to be the same, depending, as long as your weight and stuff doesn't change. But if you put on more muscle, your BMR is going to go up, even if your weight doesn't change. If you underfeed yourself, your BMR will go down, because again, your body is designed to protect you. It was not designed to lose weight. Losing weight back in the times of our ancestors meant death. So we are all here today because our ancestors evolved these mechanisms to hold on to body stores and to function at a lower rate if need be, to conserve resources. Now, we don't have that need as much anymore. We don't have famines as often as we do, at least not in most parts of the United States. So, but those mechanisms, those physiological mechanisms, are still in place. So it is really, really important to make sure you are eating at least at or above your BMR at all times in order for your metabolism to function properly. You will also feel significantly better. You will be sleeping better. You will be pooping better. You will have more energy. You will not be as hungry and lethargic and tired and brain foggy and whatever. I can't tell you how many times people come into my office and they're just like, I'm so tired. I have brain fog. I think I'm allergic to this, that, and the other thing. It's like, okay, or you're under eating by 1,000 calories every day. Let's fix that first and then worry about what else might be going on. And 9 times out of 10, it fixes the problem. So to that end, you calculate your BMR. If you find that you are eating well below that, then you may have to gradually work your way back up. So let's just say, for argument's sake, your BMR is 2,000 calories per day. You're currently eating less than 1,500. You would want to go up in increments, because going up, increasing your calorie intake by 1,000 calories a day. I know sometimes you're like, oh, that sounds so great, but it actually can be really hard, and it's difficult on your digestive system. So you can scale yourself up in increments to kind of get yourself to your BMR. Most of us should be eating above our BMR. So like I said, your BMR is your basal metabolic rate. That means baseline, absolute bottom. That is what your body needs just to maintain function. Most of us are active. And active doesn't necessarily mean working out regularly. It means you walk to the train station to go to work, or you walk your dog day to day, or you are up and moving at some point in your job. None of us, we're ambulatory adults. By that, it just means that we are getting up to go to the bathroom, right? They're just we move throughout our day, even if we feel like we don't move enough or as much as we would like to. You're still moving, right? So that accounts for some calorie burn. And then a lot of us work out on top of that, which is going to increase it dramatically more. So that's where we get into what is called an activity factor. So the activity factor is basically just taking your BMR and multiplying it by a percentage that is appropriate for the amount of appropriate for the amount of activity that you are doing. And that can be kind of hard to pinpoint, right? And that's where, again, working with a dietitian can be really, really helpful, because they know the right questions to ask. They know kind of what your macronutrient balance should look like. They know, kind of the ways to kind of, pinpoint and assess, is this enough? Is this not enough? Because a lot of times, so multiplying by 20%, or an activity factor of 1.2, is kind of for somebody who is mostly sedentary throughout the day, but maybe does, some cardio, walks a couple of times a week, things like that. 1.4 is kind of the next step up. That's for somebody who's kind of, I don't want to say aggressive, but works out fairly regularly, maybe does some strength training, things like that. And then it increases from there. I will say, on most calculators, the descriptors of those activity factors will probably make you overestimate your activity. Most of us are, it's not so much the type of work you do or the type of like exercise that you do, it's the amount of time you spend doing it. So like if you go on an hour-long run every single day, that increases your metabolic rate during that run, but then it backs right off the second you stop running. And that's 1 hour out of 23 that you're largely sedentary if you have a sedentary like desk job type of thing. That said, resistance training can definitely get tricky because muscle protein synthesis does not just occur while we are weight training. It occurs for 24 hours after we're done training. So that's, again, like working with a dietitian or a coach or somebody who kind of has a really nuanced understanding of that can be very, very beneficial. Even if it's just for a couple of sessions until you kind of get the kinks ironed out, that can be really, really helpful. Because it is so nuanced. Everybody is so different. But once you have kind of, and you also have permission to play, and I tell this to my clients too, it's like, well, here's kind of our best guess, so to speak. Let's play with this for a couple of weeks, see how it's feeling after a couple of weeks, and then we'll reassess, right? So you have your BMR, you multiply it by your activity factor. That is called your total energy expenditure, or TEE. So that is the number of calories that you need to maintain your current body weight. All right. Again, the calculators are an estimate at best. It will fluctuate, person to person, or even the same person in one season of life versus a different season of life. Those numbers may look very different. So it just depends. And all of that, again, they're estimates at best. So it may not feel quite exactly right, but that's kind of your calories to maintain your current body weight. What we do then is we talk about either a deficit or a surplus. So if you wanted to maintain your body weight, you're done. That's all you needed to do. We're going to talk about macros in a minute in terms of like how to fuel yourself a little bit better, but generally speaking, that's kind of all you need to know. If you are wanting to gain weight, like if you're wanting to bulk, you need to be in a surplus. So that means that you take that maintenance level, that total energy expenditure, or TEE, and you're going to add calories to it, usually somewhere between 200 to 500 calories a day. Another big mistake I hear people make is that they want to change their calories day to day based on their activity level. Your metabolism does not work like that. Okay. Your metabolism needs the constant source of fuel, pretty much day in and day out. All of these are going to be averages. Okay. I mentioned that the muscle protein synthesis from weightlifting takes 24 hours to take full effect. So your increased metabolic demand is in place 24 hours for it to take full effect. Usually that's like enough time for you to like finish lifting, have a rest day, and then like you're on to your next lift. So like the cycle just keeps repeating. You need that increased calorie day to day. Now, I will say in athletes, especially if you have like certain workout goals, certain like types of workouts that you're doing, game days, things like that, you're going to have much more specific fuel needs really within like the hours before and after those events. So that's, again, kind of like a higher tuned thing. But for most of us that have kind of like a general workout schedule, we have a moderately sedentary job, your calorie needs are going to be the same day to day, as long as your routine is consistent day to day. Even if it's, you don't work out every day, if like week to week your weeks look the same, your calorie needs are the same. There's also some nuance for humans who menstruate, that there's some different calorie needs there. I actually talked about that on a different episode. I can link it below if you would like. But again, there's a lot of nuance in all of this. But the point is, you don't need to eat more on the days that you work out and less on the days that you don't. You want to aim for that consistency day to day, week to week, month to month, etc., unless you are an athlete and have kind of special circumstances. So kind of with that, we can add a surplus of usually about 200 to 500 calories if we're trying to add mass, or a deficit, which is again about 200 to 500 calories per day if we're trying to lose weight. So it really isn't dramatic. So what your calorie deficit may be depends on what your total energy expenditure for maintenance is, which again is very nuanced, right? It should never, ever, ever be below your BMR. and it kind of depends. People who have kind of a smaller body size and actually kind of a shorter folks in general, there tends to be a little bit less wiggle room in terms of like that 200 to 500 calorie range between their total energy expenditure and their BMR. So if you're, let's just say we calculate your total energy expenditure is say 1800 calories, but your BMR is say 1600 calories. What we don't want to do is drop you below 1600 calories to get to a deficit, right? You just go to your whatever your BMR is. Usually it's in that 200 calorie range, and it's fine. That's totally fine. And again, we need to kind of routinely assess kind of how that feels. How does eating that much food feel in your GI system? Does it feel like you're eating too much? Does it feel like you're not eating enough? Do we need to talk about timing around your workouts and things like that? Is your energy level good? Are you recovering from your workouts well? Are you sleeping okay? What barriers are you running into? Are you having a hard time getting that much food in? Are you having a hard time feeling full if you've cut back? All of those things matter. And again, that's where a dietitian is gold. Like a dietitian is going to come in and kind of, be able to pinpoint one, if there's like an imbalance somewhere, because a lot of times that can lead to some of those things, but also just kind of, give you tips and tricks and like practical advice as to how to take where you're at, the barriers you're facing, and get you to your goal. I don't want to talk too much about macros because it can be kind of a big can of worms, but I do think it's important to talk about it just a little bit. So macros, if you're unfamiliar, it's an acronym, for macronutrients. Macronutrients are where our calories come from. So all foods have some combination of protein, carbohydrate, and fat. Those three things make up our macronutrients. Those are the three types of macronutrients, and they're where all calories are derived from in our diet. Okay. Some foods have more protein and less carbs and fat. Some foods have a lot of carbs, but no protein or fat. And some foods just have a blend of all three in some variety. That's what I'm not getting into here, but just so you know that all the calories that you eat, if we take it a step further, there is somewhat of an ideal balance of protein, carbohydrates, and fat in terms of where those calories are coming from. Generally speaking, your body uses fat and carbs as energy. So it's going to break those two molecules down to be fuel for whatever your body is doing throughout the day. It's things like your heart beating, your lungs breathing, your brain functioning, your GI tract working, your workouts, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, your body's going to use protein for the most part as a building block. It's going to use protein to build things up. The most obvious form being, of course, building or maintaining muscle mass, I should say. That said, there's a lot of stuff that breaks down and gets regenerated in your body every single day that you have no idea happens, and your body needs protein for those things too. So it uses protein to build, fat and carbs for energy. Now, there is like somewhat of an ideal in terms of kind of the balance of those three. But again, just like the calories are very nuanced and kind of wishy-washy, the macros are very nuanced and wishy-washy as well. What I'm going to kind of give you are some very general recommendations for kind of like the general population, people who, again, are relatively healthy, who you're ambulatory, maybe have a mostly sedentary job, but are active kind of intentionally outside of that. Now, if you have certain diseases like diabetes, chronic kidney disease, heart failure, things like that, then all of this is very different. And that is definitely a situation in which you would want to talk to a dietitian, because that's something where we need to assess your unique case, any medications you're on, all of that good fun stuff. But that's what dietitians do. That's we take people who have an illness, and we talk about the ways in which nutrition affects that illness and any modifications to your nutrition that we need to make to improve it. So that's kind of our bread and butter. So definitely reach out to a dietitian if you have any of those diagnoses, or even if you're just kind of like not sure how this applies to you, and any other conditions that you may have. very general recommendation. I usually recommend that at least half of your intake be carbohydrates. So that means at least half the calories that you're eating is going to be carbohydrates. That's a number that kind of like people are like, whoa, what? I thought carbs are bad for you. They're not bad for you at all. They're actually your body's preferred fuel source, and that's why you need so many of them. That's what your body is actually most adapted to. Simba's coming to say hello. It's what your body is most adapted to break down and utilize for fuel. Your brain in particular needs quite a few carbohydrates, but other organ systems use them as well. So to get there, you take your total energy expenditure, so that number that we calculated for maintenance, or if you're calculating in a surplus or a deficit, then take whatever kind of that final calorie number is for you, and you're going to divide that number by 8. That 8 accounts for half the calories are going to be coming from the carbs, and then you're going to get 4 calories for every gram of carbs. So you basically divide that number by 8, and that is the number of grams of carbohydrates that you should be eating in a day. Now, just to kind of give you a rough estimate, if you're eating 2,000 calories per day, that puts you at about 250 grams of carbohydrate per day. Again, that might be a number where people are like, oh, that's appropriate. Okay. That's what decades of research have shown to be appropriate. Again, even if you have things like diabetes and stuff like that, there may be some nuance there, but to be perfectly honest with you, that has more to do with timing and spacing and portions, not the overall total. I would still probably give somebody with diabetes that general total. I might take it down a little bit, but I'm more focused on how often they eat carbohydrates and how much they eat at one time. Not the overall amount. So that's just kind of to give you a rough estimate, right? When it comes to protein, I actually don't do it as a percentage of your total calories. I usually do it by your weight. Again, there's a lot of misinformation out there about protein. There's a lot of trainers who say like you should be eating like a gram per pound, which is frankly a crazy amount of protein. That is like, so in the medical world, we deal in kilograms. So that is like over 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that is something I would give like a burn victim in the hospital who has like literally like half their body of skin to regenerate. That is not something that I would give the average person who is healthy. I usually tell people divide your weight into kilograms first. So that means divide your body weight into like 2.2. Which is just the standard conversion. So I, for example, weigh about 200 pounds. My weight in kilograms is about 90 pounds, or 90 kilograms rather. And then I say anywhere from like 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So that means I'm anywhere from like 90 to I think about 100 or so grams of protein per day. And again, these numbers fluctuate, right? So like I said, it was 90 to 100. I said 250 grams of carbs earlier. That can truly be anywhere from like 150 to 350 on any given day. It's going to fluctuate, and that's totally okay. You do not have to hit these numbers exactly. Same with protein. I would say you definitely want to try to get the lower end of your protein, but if I'm like 90 one day and like 120 the next, like that's fine in terms of protein. Like those numbers can truly fluctuate that much rather. Fat, again, it's really important to have in our diet, and I usually just kind of tell people like fat kind of balances out the rest. So it's usually going to be about 30% of your calories. So kind of same where we divided our total calories by 8 to get the carbs. I tell people to divide it by 6 to get their fat, and that usually kind of roughly edges out the middle. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what those carbs, protein, and fat can and kind of should look like. Again, it's going to vary day to day, and that's totally fine. And what we're looking for is, we don't want you to be like egregiously different from that. So, if your goal is 90 grams of protein and you're at best getting 50, that's something to kind of have a conversation about. That said, if you have different conditions, so like, if you have chronic kidney disease, you may not want to be eating 90 grams of protein, because that's too much for your kidneys to handle in your particular situation. And again, a dietitian is going to be the person to kind of walk you through, okay, then what does that look like for you? So I hope that helps. I just tried to address kind of the questions that I get most commonly, and the mistakes I see people make. But know that like, this is all going to be nuanced. You can do all the math in the world, but like, we still can't capture the nuance of a human body with any equation. Even with the indirect calorimeters or things like that, we still can't fully assess how your body's functioning day to day and what it needs. So that's where things like paying attention to energy levels, mental stress, your mood, your appetite, things of that nature, are going to be helpful in kind of you determining, is this right for me? And of course, as always, a dietitian is right here to help you if that is something that you feel would be beneficial. So I will leave you with that one for today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.